2,670 metres beneath the surface, something rests in the dark that nobody knows about except one person. You're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds gently and without urgency. Tonight, we explore the ancient structure the Navy can't fully explain, not as a thriller, but as a quiet story of discovery, depth, and the long patience of the sea. Let the rain fall steady as the story sinks slowly downward. If you want, feel free to subscribe, leave a like, and tell me what time it is where you are in the comments. In 1977, a routine mapping expedition off the coast of Japan recorded something that didn't belong in any geological textbook. The sonar operators marked it, filed their reports, and went home to dinner. It would be decades before anyone looked at those readings closely enough to ask the uncomfortable questions. You're sitting in a climate-controlled room somewhere in Southern California, watching green lines paint themselves across a black screen. The year is 1977, and you're 23 years old, fresh out of technical school, operating equipment that cost more than your parents' house. The sonar array dangles 2,670 metres below your ship, dragging through darkness that has never seen sunlight, sending back information about a world that exists in permanent midnight. The coffee in your mug went cold 3 hours ago. You should dump it and get fresh. But that would mean standing up, walking 15 feet to the galley, and you found that if you stay perfectly still in your chair, if you don't break the rhythm of watching these glowing lines accumulate data, something like meditation happens, your mind empties out. The gentle roll of the ship becomes your heartbeat. The soft ping of the sonar becomes your breath. Your supervisor, a man named Mitchell, who spent 18 years in the actual Navy before taking this civilian contract, walks past your station every 40 minutes like clockwork. He never says anything unless your screen shows something worth discussing. You've learned not to expect conversation. The mapping work is hypnotic and dull, and occasionally punctuated by moments of genuine wonder when the seafloor reveals an unexpected canyon or a volcanic formation that the geology teams will spend months analysing. Today, the seafloor has been flat for 6 hours. Not perfectly flat, nothing in nature achieves that, but consistent enough that your screen shows gentle undulations, minor variations in depth that translate to soft hills and shallow valleys, sediment accumulated over millions of years, the crushing weight of all that water pressing down, darkness so complete that evolutionary pressure eliminated eyes from the creatures living there, because sight became an expensive biological luxury with no return on investment. You notice the change before your conscious mind registers what you're seeing. Your hand moves toward the contrast dial, adjusting the display. The lines on your screen show something rising from the sea floor, not gradually, the way an underwater hill would appear, but with edges, corners, angles that terminate rather than fade. You glance at Mitchell's empty chair. He's gone to check on the equipment 3 rooms over, where the temperature sensors keep requiring calibration. You could call him back, but you've only been on this job for 7 months, and you've already learned that enthusiasm gets mistaken for inexperience. Better to watch. Better to be certain before you interrupt someone's routine. The shape continues revealing itself as your ship moves forward. Your sonar is painting a picture line by line, the way those new fax machines construct images strip by strip. What you're seeing doesn't make sense. The edges are too defined. The proportions are too regular. You think about coral formations, about lava flows that sometimes cool into columnar structures that look deliberately carved. You think about pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in clouds and patterns in randomness. But you keep watching, and the structure keeps not being random. Mitchell returns with a clipboard and a fresh cup of coffee that actually steams. He glances at your screen with the casual attention of someone who has seen 10,000 hours of seafloor mapping and expects the next 10,000 to look identical. Then he stops, sets his coffee down carefully. He leans in close enough that you can smell the mint gum he chews constantly to mask his cigarette habit. "How long has it been rendering like that?" he asks. "About 8 minutes, you tell him. He studies the screen in silence. You've learned that Mitchell's silences contain meaning. Short silences mean he's thinking. Long silences mean he's recalculating something fundamental. This silence stretches past 30 seconds, which in the world of sonar monitoring feels like an eternity. "Mark the coordinates," he finally says, "then increase the resolution and do another pass." You spend the next 4 hours running grid patterns over the area, building up a more detailed picture. The structure, if that's what it is, measures roughly 90 meters at its longest point. The height varies, but the tallest section rises about 12 meters from the seafloor. The angles remain crisp even under high-resolution scanning. There are what appear to be right angles, parallel lines, symmetry that natural erosion rarely produces. By the time your shift ends, you've documented everything you can from this distance. Mitchell has already radioed the findings back to the research coordinator. You head to your bunk thinking about graduate students who will eventually analyse this data, about papers that might get published, and about whether you've just spent 8 hours mapping an underwater rock formation that happens to look interesting, or whether you found something genuinely strange. Sleep comes slowly. When it finally arrives, you dream about endless flat plains of sediment and something geometric rising from the darkness like a monument to purposes you cannot fathom. The research coordinator is a woman named Dr. Patricia Henshaw, and she has a reputation for treating wild claims with the same polite skepticism a librarian might use when asked about the folklore section. You've never met her in person. She works out of an office in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, coordinating data from a dozen different survey ships. But you've heard her voice on the radio often enough to recognise the particular tone she uses when she thinks someone is wasting her time, but is too professional to say so directly. Mitchell handles the radio conversation while you listen. He describes the coordinates, the dimensions, and the angles. His voice stays flat, reciting facts without interpretation. Smart. Dr. Henshaw doesn't like speculation. She likes measurements, timestamps, and precise instrument readings. "We'll add it to the anomaly list," she says finally. "Continue your current survey pattern. We'll review the data during the next analysis cycle, the anomaly list." You learn later that this is where unusual readings go to wait for someone with grant funding and spare time to investigate. Most entries on the anomaly list never get investigated at all. They sit in filing cabinets, transferred eventually to digital storage, becoming footnotes in the vast archive of unexplained but ultimately unimportant oceanic oddities. 3 years pass. You move on to a different research vessel, then leave maritime work entirely for a job maintaining medical imaging equipment in Phoenix, Arizona. You think about the structure occasionally, usually late at night when your mind wanders before sleep. You wonder if anyone ever went back. You wonder if the angles were real, or just artifacts of the sonar resolution, tricks of interpretation, or wishful thinking translated into geometric certainty. In 1984, a Japanese research team investigating tectonic activity in the same region picks up the structure on their equipment. They're not looking for archaeological anomalies. They're measuring fault lines and stress points, trying to predict where the next earthquake might originate. But their sonar is newer than what you were using in 1977, with better resolution and more sophisticated processing. When their graduate student notices the unusual formation, she mentions it to her supervisor, who mentions it to the expedition lead, who includes it as a minor note in their published findings. The note is 3 sentences long. It appears on page 47 of a 73-page report about seafloor spreading and plate subduction. Almost nobody reads it. The few who do assume it's describing a basalt formation, or possibly a coral structure that has somehow survived at that depth where coral shouldn't exist. One person who reads it is a geologist named Robert Schoch, who has built a career studying weathering patterns in ancient stone. He notices the mention because he's recently published a controversial paper suggesting that water erosion on the Sphinx in Egypt indicates a construction date far older than traditional archaeology accepts. His colleagues have not been kind about this theory. He's learned to look for anomalies in unlikely places, because sometimes unlikely places contain evidence that reshapes timelines everyone thought were settled. Schock files the information away. He has no funding to investigate seafloor structures off Japan. He has no expertise in deep ocean geology. But he remembers the coordinates, and he remembers the word choice in that 3-sentence description. Regular geometric formations inconsistent with known volcanic processes. Another 3 years pass. The structure sits in darkness, accumulating sediment, hosting whatever blind creatures drift through the eternal midnight of the deep ocean floor. No human eyes see it. No submersibles visit. It exists in that strange category of things that are known but not known, documented but not examined, present in databases but absent from consciousness. Then, in 1987, a Japanese dive tour operator named Kihachiro Aratake takes a recreational trip to the underwater cliffs near Yonaguni Island. He's looking for hammerhead sharks, which gather in those waters during certain seasons and attract divers willing to pay premium rates for the experience. The water here is much shallower than where you mapped the structure in 1977, only about 25 metres deep, but the geography is similar. Rocky formations, strong currents, darkness that arrives suddenly when you descend below the photic zone. Aratake sees something that makes him forget about sharks entirely. Massive stone structures rising from the seafloor, covered in marine growth but clearly showing steps, terraces, and platforms. Right angles carved into rock. He surfaces, checks his coordinates, and dives again the next day with a camera. The photographs he brings back look like something from an ancient temple complex. Except they're underwater, and nobody remembers any temples being built in this location, and the local history contains no stories about flooded civilizations or sunken cities. Word spread slowly at first, the way unusual discoveries do when they lack institutional backing. Diving magazines publish Aratake's photos. Marine archaeology enthusiasts share the images. Someone remembers that 3-sentence note from the 1984 tectonic study and wonders if there might be a connection. Someone else pulls the original 1977 sonar data from the anomaly archive and notices that the deeper structure you mapped sits roughly 100 kilometers from the shallow formations Aratake discovered. By 1992, the site near Yonaguni has attracted enough attention that Japanese television sends a documentary crew. They film the terraces and platforms, the angles and edges, and the suggestions of carved channels and possible roads. They interview Aratake, who has been diving the site regularly for 5 years. They interview marine biologists who confirm that the formations are rock, not coral. They interview geologists who cannot agree whether the shapes are natural or artificial. The documentary airs. It reaches the kind of audience that stays up late watching speculative programming about pyramids and ancient mysteries. Most academic researchers ignore it. A few watch with professional curiosity. One of them is a marine geologist from Boston University named Masaki Kimura, who has spent 20 years studying underwater formations and has developed an instinct for distinguishing geological accidents from deliberate construction. Kimura watches the documentary twice. Then he books a flight to Japan. You're 41 years old now, living in Phoenix, working your medical imaging job, and following a routine that has calcified into comfortable predictability. You haven't thought about the structure in years. Your life contains other concerns, a mortgage, a daughter in middle school, and a marriage that has settled into the kind of quiet partnership where whole days pass without significant conversation, which you've learned is not necessarily a bad thing. Then one evening you're channel surfing after dinner, and you catch the tail end of a news segment about underwater ruins near Japan. The footage shows stone platforms and terraces, geometric formations that look too regular to be accidents. The reporter mentions ongoing research by a professor named Kimura. The segment lasts maybe 90 seconds before cutting to a commercial about arthritis medication. Something in your memory stirs. You can't immediately place why the footage feels familiar, but the feeling persists through the evening, through helping your daughter with algebra homework, and through brushing your teeth before bed. You lie awake thinking about green lines on a black screen, about angles emerging from sediment, and about Mitchell's long silence while he studied your display. The next day you call your old supervisor. You haven't spoken to Mitchell in nearly 10 years, but you still have his number in your address book, and when you dial, he answers on the third ring with the same gruff "Mitchell here" he used on the research vessel. You ask if he remembers the structure from 1977. The line goes quiet long enough that you think the connection might have dropped. Then Mitchell says, "The one near Yonaguni? That's near where we found it," you say. "I know," Mitchell tells you. "I've been following the coverage. Different location, shallower water, but similar characteristics. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? You wonder many things. Whether the two sites are related, whether the structure you mapped still sits untouched in the darkness, or whether someone has finally sent a submersible to investigate, whether the angles you documented were real, or just artifacts of enthusiasm and outdated equipment. Mitchell tells you that a research team is planning an expedition to the deeper site. Private funding, mostly Japanese researchers with a few American consultants. They're building a custom submersible that can handle the pressure at 2,600 meters. They've requested the original 1977 sonar data from the archives. They called me last month, Mitchell says. Asked if I wanted to consult. Told them I'm too old for that nonsense, but I sent them copies of our mapping records. You ask if they found anything interesting in the data. Mitchell says they're still analysing it, still planning the expedition. These things take time. Funding, permits, coordination with universities and government agencies that want assurance that nothing will be damaged or disturbed. You thank Mitchell and hang up. You try to return to your normal evening, dinner, television, the familiar rituals, but your mind keeps drifting to that structure sitting in darkness, waiting in silence for its secrets to be revealed or remain buried under another million years of sediment. Professor Masaki Kimura spends 3 years diving the Yonaguni site before he reaches any conclusions he's willing to defend publicly. He's a careful man, trained in the scientific method, aware that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. He knows what happened to colleagues who published speculative theories before gathering sufficient data. He knows that a professional reputation is easier to lose than to rebuild. What he finds during those 3 years of diving, measuring, photographing, and analysing challenges his initial assumptions about geological processes. The terraces show consistent height ratios of about 2.5 to 1, not a ratio that appears in random erosion patterns. The platforms intersect at right angles more frequently than statistical chance would predict. There are features that look like post holes, as if wooden structures once stood on these stone foundations. There are channels that seem designed for drainage, and others that might have directed water flow for some purpose impossible to determine without understanding the culture that created them, if a culture created them. That remains the central question. Kimura documents everything that supports the artificial construction hypothesis, but he's honest enough to also document everything that supports the natural formation theory. The rock is local sandstone, not imported from distant quarries. There are no tool marks visible under marine growth, no inscriptions, no artifacts that would definitively indicate human activity. He consults with other geologists. Some agree the formations look suspicious. Others insist that water and geological processes can produce remarkably regular shapes given enough time. Lava flows create columnar basalt with geometric precision. Tidal action carves repeating patterns. Sedimentary layers split along parallel planes that look machine-cut, but form through purely natural mechanisms. The debate becomes heated in the way academic debates do, with careers and theories staked on interpretations of the same evidence. Papers get published, rebuttals get published, conferences invite presentations from both sides. The formations near Yonaguni become a case study in how difficult it is to distinguish intentional construction from natural processes when both can produce similar results. Meanwhile, the deeper structure you mapped in 1977 continues waiting. The planned expedition encounters delays, funding issues, equipment problems, and political complications regarding international waters and research permits. Years pass. The structure accumulates another millimetre of sediment. The blind creatures of the deep ocean drift past its angles, entirely unconcerned with whether those angles mean something or nothing. In 1998, a documentary team finally secures funding for a submersible dive to the deeper site. They partner with a marine research institute that has the necessary equipment and expertise. The dive is scheduled for September, during a weather window when the current should be manageable. You learn about this from a magazine article. Popular Science runs a piece about underwater archaeology, and in the middle of the article there's a paragraph about the upcoming expedition. They mention the coordinates. You recognise them immediately. They're the same coordinates you logged in 1977. You consider reaching out to the research team, offering your perspective as the person who first documented the structure. But what would you tell them? That you saw some interesting sonar readings 21 years ago? That you've occasionally wondered whether those readings represented something real? You have no expertise to offer, no insights beyond what's already in the archived data. You would be at best a footnote, at worst a distraction. So you do nothing. You wait, like everyone else interested in the mystery, for the dive results to be published. The submersible descends through layers of light and darkness, through zones where temperature drops and pressure increases, and through depths where whole ecosystems exist that humans never witnessed until the last few decades. The descent takes hours. The crew, 2 marine geologists and a submersible pilot, monitor instruments, adjust ballast, and watch the depth gauge climb toward numbers that represent crushing force beyond human survival. At 2,600 metres, darkness is absolute. The submersible's lights illuminate maybe 15 metres in any direction, creating a sphere of visibility in an ocean of nothing. Particles drift through the light beams, marine snow they call it. The constant rain of organic matter falling from the surface waters toward the abyssal plain. The effect is hypnotic, like driving through a snowstorm at night, except the snow never stops and the night never ends. The seafloor appears gradually in the downward-facing lights. Sediment as expected, gentle undulations, a few scattered rocks that probably tumbled down from the shallower continental shelf during some ancient underwater landslide. The pilot adjusts the submersible's position according to the coordinates from your 1977 survey, compensating for drift and current. Then, lights find edges. The 2 geologists, Dr. Sarah Merchant from Oregon State University and Dr. Takeshi Nakamura from the University of Tokyo, have spent months preparing for this moment. They've studied the sonar data, run simulations, and debated interpretations. They've prepared themselves for the possibility that the structure is nothing but an interesting rock formation, that the angles are artifacts of sonar resolution, and that 21 years of anticipation will resolve into minor disappointment. What they see through the submersible's viewport makes Dr. Merchant whisper something that gets picked up by the audio recording system, and later transcribed as, "Oh my God." Dr. Nakamura says nothing, but his hand moves to the camera controls and he begins documenting what the lights reveal. The structure rises from the sea floor like a piece of ancient architecture dropped into the wrong location. Not gradually, the way geological formations rise, but with defined edges and clear transitions between levels. There are what appear to be steps, not perfect stairs in the modern sense, but rises of consistent height leading from one platform to another. There are corners that meet at close to 90 degrees. There are surfaces that, while covered in sediment and marine growth, show a flatness inconsistent with natural erosion. The submersible makes several passes, photographing from different angles, taking measurements with laser rangefinders, and collecting samples of the rock and the marine organisms growing on it. The structure is larger than the sonar suggested, roughly 120 metres at its longest point, with multiple levels that create a terraced effect. The highest terrace rises about 15 metres above the surrounding seafloor. Dr. Merchant notices something during the third pass. a series of parallel grooves on one of the flat surfaces, each about 15 centimetres wide, spaced at regular intervals. She asks the pilot to position the submersible for a closer look. The grooves run straight for about 3 metres, then stop abruptly at what might be a corner or edge, though marine growth obscures the details. "Those look deliberate," she says to Dr. Nakamura. He's more cautious. "They could be stress fractures. Sedimentary rock sometimes cracks in parallel patterns when the layers shift. At that regular spacing, it's possible." They document the grooves extensively. They document everything: the angles, the terraces, the surfaces, and the transitions between different levels. They collect rock samples from multiple locations. They record water temperature, current direction, and sediment composition. They work with the methodical thoroughness of people who know this might be their only chance to gather data from this site, that funding for a return trip is uncertain, and that what they document today will form the basis for years of analysis and debate. After 6 hours on the seafloor, the submersible begins its ascent. The structure disappears into darkness below them. Doctor. Merchant watches through the downward viewport until the lights can no longer reach the stone, until there's nothing visible except marine snow falling through empty water. "What do you think it is?" the pilot asks. Dr. Merchant considers the question carefully. She's spent 6 hours examining the structure firsthand, something no one else has done. She's seen details the sonar couldn't capture. She's seen enough to know that simple answers won't suffice. "I think," she says finally, "it's something we need to study a lot more before we start making claims." Dr. Nakamura nods in agreement. They've documented something extraordinary. Whether it's extraordinarily interesting geology or evidence of something else entirely remains an open question. The samples return to the surface. The photographs get processed. The measurements get entered into databases and spreadsheets. Dr. Merchant and Dr. Nakamura spend 3 months analysing the data before they write anything for publication. Even then, their paper is careful, hedged with qualifications, and deliberately avoids conclusions they cannot definitively support. The rock samples prove to be local sandstone, approximately 20 to 30 million years old, based on radiometric dating of mineral inclusions. This timing coincides with volcanic activity known to have occurred in the region during the Oligocene epoch. The samples show no obvious tool marks and no signs of cutting or deliberate shaping. Under electron microscopy, the grain structure appears consistent with sedimentary formation. Sand grains compressed over millions of years into solid stone, then exposed to seawater and marine organisms. None of this rules out human modification. Ancient builders often worked with local materials, shaping existing rock rather than importing stone from distant quarries. The absence of obvious tool marks might indicate weathering that has erased surface details or construction techniques that didn't leave the kind of marks modern tools would create. The parallel grooves prove more interesting. Analysis suggests they formed through water erosion, repeated flow along the same channels, gradually deepening the paths over thousands of years. But the spacing remains difficult to explain through purely natural processes. Water erosion typically creates irregular patterns, following the path of least resistance, branching and merging in fractal complexity. These grooves run parallel for their entire length, maintaining consistent width and depth. "Could be natural, Doctor," Merchant tells a colleague during a conference presentation. "Could be that we're seeing a 1 in a million formation where everything happened to align just right. Or it could be that someone carved drainage channels 20,000 years ago, and erosion has been following those channels ever since." The colleague asks what evidence would prove deliberate construction. Dr. Merchant admits she's not sure. Tool marks would help, artifacts would be definitive. But in the absence of those, how do you distinguish between impressive natural formations and weathered artificial constructions? How do you account for 2,600 metres of water pressure and potentially millions of years of erosion, obscuring whatever evidence might once have existed? The paper gets published in a respected marine geology journal. The conclusion section reads like a masterpiece of academic caution. The structure exhibits characteristics consistent with both natural geological processes and possible human modification. Further investigation is required before definitive conclusions can be drawn. Some of their colleagues appreciate the careful approach. Others criticise it as fence-sitting, as an unwillingness to take a position. A few point out that if this same structure were found on dry land, nobody would question whether it was artificial. The angles, the terraces, and the apparent steps would be immediately recognised as construction. But this structure isn't on dry land. It sits at the bottom of the ocean, in a location that would have been dry land only during the most extreme sea level drops of the last ice age, when glaciers locked up enough water to lower ocean levels by more than 100 metres. Even then, even at the maximum glaciation of the last glacial maximum roughly 20,000 years ago, this site would still have been underwater. The depth is simply too great. Unless the structure is much older than 20,000 years, unless it predates any known civilization by a margin that makes archaeologists uncomfortable, unless it represents technology or culture that existed before written history, before pottery, before agriculture, in that vast stretch of time when humans were supposedly just hunter-gatherers, leaving behind nothing but stone tools and cave paintings, these possibilities don't appear in the published paper. Dr. Merchant and Dr. Nakamura know better than to speculate in print about civilization timelines that contradict established archaeology. But they think about the possibilities privately, late at night, reviewing the photographs and measurements, wondering what they've really found. You're 45 years old when the paper gets published, and you read it 3 times, slowly, trying to reconcile the technical descriptions with your memory of green lines on a black screen. The coordinates match, the dimensions approximately match, though the submersible cruise measurements are more precise than what your sonar could have detected. This is definitely the same structure you mapped in 1977. Reading the paper feels strange. You contributed nothing to the research except being the first person to notice something unusual on a sonar display. Yet you feel connected to the discovery in ways that are difficult to articulate. You mapped this structure before anyone knew it might be important. You documented its location at a time when documentation meant handwritten logbook entries and coordinates radioed back to research coordinators who filed them in archives nobody expected to reference again. You consider writing to Dr. Merchant, introducing yourself as the original sonar operator, offering what? Congratulations. Historical perspective. You draft several emails and delete them all. What you have to say isn't important enough to warrant interrupting someone's research schedule, but the structure stays in your thoughts. You start following the academic debate, reading papers from geologists who argue the formation is natural, and papers from other geologists who insist the angles are too regular and the proportions too consistent. You read speculative articles in popular magazines and watch television documentaries that take more liberties with interpretation than Dr. Merchant would ever approve. One documentary particularly annoys you. It features dramatic music and computer-generated reconstructions showing elaborate temples and cities, complete with fictional inhabitants wearing vague ancient costumes and performing ceremonies the documentary makers invented out of whole cloth. The narrator speaks in breathless tones about lost civilizations and forbidden knowledge and what mainstream science refuses to acknowledge. The documentary mentions the structure you mapped, but it gets the date wrong, claiming it was discovered in 1987 rather than documented in 77. They interview someone described as an expert on ancient mysteries, though his credentials seem limited to having written several books on the subject. He talks about Atlantis and sunken continents and advanced ancient technologies, none of which have any connection to the careful, measured findings in Dr. Merchant's paper. You turn off the documentary halfway through. This isn't what you discovered. You discovered some interesting sonar readings that might indicate geological formations worth studying. You didn't discover proof of lost civilizations or ancient technologies. You discovered angles and proportions that raise questions but provide no answers. The problem, you're beginning to realize, is that the structure doesn't fit neatly into existing categories. It's not obviously natural, but it's not obviously artificial either. It exists in that ambiguous space where multiple interpretations remain possible, where the evidence supports different conclusions depending on which assumptions you start with. If you assume that ancient humans couldn't have built large stone structures before the accepted dates for the rise of civilization, then the structure must be natural, regardless of how regular its angles appear. If you assume that humans might have developed construction capabilities earlier than currently believed, then the structure might be artificial, evidence of cultures that left few other traces. Neither assumption is provable from the available data. The structure sits in darkness, refusing to clearly declare its origins, maintaining its mystery through simple ambiguity. 3 more years pass. The debate continues in academic journals and online forums. Additional expeditions visit the Yonaguni site in shallow water, bringing more sophisticated scanning equipment, taking more photographs, and collecting more samples. Some researchers remain convinced the formations are natural, others grow increasingly certain they're artificial. The two sides talk past each other, emphasizing different aspects of the same evidence. Dr. Kimura publishes a detailed analysis arguing for artificial construction. He points to the consistent angles, the apparent tool marks on some surfaces, and the way different terraces align with each other. He notes that similar step formations appear in ancient construction sites around the Pacific Rim, suggesting cultural connections or parallel development of architectural styles. A team from the Geological Survey of Japan publishes a rebuttal. They demonstrate how sandstone layers can fracture along parallel planes, creating the appearance of deliberate cutting. They show examples from other locations where entirely natural formations display geometric regularity. They argue that tool marks can be explained as scratches from rocks dragged by currents, or impact points where falling stones hit softer sediment. Neither paper definitively proves its case. The evidence remains stubbornly interpretable from multiple angles. Meanwhile, at the deeper site, the structure you mapped, funding for further investigation remains elusive. Dr. Merchant applies for grants through her university and is turned down twice. The research committees appreciate the interesting findings, but they're not convinced that additional dives would produce sufficiently valuable data to justify the cost. Deepwater submersible work is expensive, without strong indication that the site contains something more than interesting geology. Funding priorities go elsewhere. Dr. Nakamura has better luck in Japan, securing a small grant for analysis of the rock samples and development of a proposal for acoustic mapping, using more advanced equipment than what your 1977 sonar could provide. He spends a year building relationships with Japanese research institutes, making the case that understanding these underwater formations has value regardless of whether they're natural or artificial. The structures provide insight into geological processes in the region. They help model how seafloor features respond to tectonic activity. They're worth studying even if they never prove to be anything more than unusually regular stone formations. The grant comes through in 2003. Dr. Nakamura secures ship time and equipment access for a month-long expedition. They'll use side scans, sonar, multi-beam echo sounders, and sub-bottom profilers to create detailed 3-dimensional maps of the structure and the surrounding area. If funding extends far enough, they might attempt another submersible dive to collect additional samples and photograph features they couldn't reach during the first expedition. You read about this in a science newsletter you've subscribed to, one of those weekly summaries that aggregates research announcements and expedition updates. The newsletter includes a link to Dr. Nakamura's research proposal. You click through and spend an evening reading about acoustic imaging techniques and seafloor mapping protocols, understanding maybe 30% of the technical details but grasping the essential idea. They're going back to see what else they can learn. Part of you wants to be there, not as a researcher, you lack the credentials and expertise, but as a witness. You want to see the data come in, watch the maps build themselves from sound waves, and compare the results to those green lines you watched paint themselves across your screen 26 years ago. But you're 47 years old with a job and a mortgage and a daughter applying to colleges. You're not going to Japan to watch sonar equipment operate. You're going to stay in Phoenix and read about the results when they get published, the same as everyone else following this story. Still, you allow yourself a moment of connection to that younger version of yourself, sitting in a climate-controlled room on a research vessel, watching something emerge from data that nobody else was paying attention to yet. You didn't know what you were seeing. You still don't know what it means. But you saw it first, and that counts for something, even if only privately, even if it never appears in any paper or acknowledgement. The 2003 expedition produces maps of unprecedented detail. The acoustic imaging reveals features the earlier sonar missed, additional terraces at the structure's base, variations in the stone that might indicate different construction phases or different geological events, and patterns in the surrounding seafloor that suggest the structure isn't isolated but part of a larger complex of formations. Dr. Nakamura publishes the results with characteristic caution. The new data doesn't resolve the fundamental questions. If anything, it makes the mystery deeper. The additional terraces show the same regular proportions as the main structure. The surrounding formations include more parallel grooves, more right angles, and more suggestions of intentional design, but still no definitive proof. One finding particularly intrigues researchers. The acoustic mapping reveals what might be a channel or pathway, connecting the main structure to a smaller formation about 50 meters away. The channel runs straight, maintains consistent depth, and appears to have been carved into the bedrock rather than deposited on top of it. Natural channels created by water flow typically meander, following the path of least resistance. This channel runs straight as if someone decided on a destination and carved the most direct route. Or, as critics point out, it could be a geological fault line. Tectonic stress creates linear features in bedrock. Fractures propagate along straight paths determined by crystalline structure and stress distribution. The fact that the channel looks deliberately carved doesn't mean it was. The debate continues. Papers get published. Conferences feature presentations from both sides. Graduate students write dissertations analysing the data from different theoretical frameworks. The structure becomes a case study in epistemology. How do we know what we know? What counts as sufficient evidence? At what point does probability tip from interesting coincidence to deliberate construction? You follow all of this from Phoenix. Your daughter goes off to college. Your marriage ends quietly, not through dramatic conflict, but through the gradual realization that you and your wife have become strangers sharing a house. You move into an apartment, downsize your life, and find that solitude suits you better than you expected. The structure remains your strange hobby. You collect papers and articles, bookmark websites, and follow research announcements. Most people who know about your interest assume it's just eccentric curiosity. They don't understand the connection you feel to something you encountered briefly 28 years ago. In 2007, you retire early from the medical imaging job. The company offers buyout packages to reduce staff, and you take the offer, calculating that your savings plus social security will cover a modest lifestyle. You're 53 years old, and the prospect of another 15 years maintaining equipment that you've long since stopped finding interesting feels like slow suffocation. Instead, you decide to do something you've thought about for years but never prioritized. You book a flight to Japan. The trip isn't about finding answers. You know better than to expect some revelation, some moment where the structure's purpose becomes clear. You want to see the location. Stand on the shore near Yonaguni Island and look out at water that covers stone formations people have been debating for 20 years. Visit the research institute where Dr. Nakamura works if they'll let you. Maybe take a diving tour, though you're not certified and would need training first. Mostly you want to acknowledge your connection to this mystery in some physical way. You spent decades thinking about the structure from 6,000 miles away. Now you want to reduce that distance, even if you can't eliminate it entirely. The flight is long. You have time to wonder whether this trip is self-indulgent foolishness or some necessary ritual to complete a cycle that started in 1977. Maybe both. Maybe the distinction doesn't matter. You arrive in Okinawa and take a smaller plane to Yonaguni, the westernmost inhabited island in Japan. The island is small, maybe 11 square miles of land with a few thousand permanent residents. Tourism focuses mainly on the underwater formations and the diving opportunities they provide. You check into a modest hotel and spend the first day just walking, getting oriented, and adjusting to the time zone. The next morning you visit the local dive centre. You explain that you're not certified but want to understand the site. The operator, a weathered man in his 60s who introduces himself as Hiroshi, studies you with the particular assessment dive professionals use to determine if someone will be trouble or tolerable. You want to see the ruins? He asks in careful English. If possible, you say. Hiroshi considers this. I have a group going this afternoon, certified divers only underwater, but you can snorkel at the surface and see the shallow terraces. Not the same as diving to the deeper structures, but better than photographs. You agree immediately. 4 hours later you're in a wetsuit floating at the surface while divers below you explore terraces and platforms that might be natural formations or might be something else. The water is remarkably clear. Sunlight penetrates deep enough that you can see the upper levels of the structure and can trace the edges and angles even from the surface. It looks artificial. Your gut reaction, based on no expertise whatsoever, is that someone built this. The proportions feel too regular. The way different levels connect seems intentional. But you also know that gut reactions aren't evidence, that human pattern recognition is both powerful and unreliable, and that you're predisposed to see intention because you want the mystery to resolve into something remarkable. You float for an hour, watching divers move across the stone, seeing them pause to examine details or take photographs. The structure extends farther than you can see from the surface. The portions visible to you probably represent only 10 or 15% of the total formation. When everyone surfaces, Hiroshi asks what you thought. You tell him honestly that you don't know what to think. He laughs at this, a short bark of amusement. Good answer, he says. Too many people show up already certain. They see what they want to see. You see what's there, which is something we don't understand yet. Back on shore, you ask Hiroshi what he believes. He's been diving this site for 15 years and has spent more time observing these formations than almost anyone alive. If anyone has earned the right to an opinion, it's him. He takes his time answering. You've learned that considered silence often precedes the most useful responses. I think, he finally says, that it doesn't matter what I believe. The structure is what it is. We can study it, photograph it, measure it, and debate it. But it's not going to change based on our interpretations. Either people built it or geology made it. Either way, it's been here longer than any of us will be alive, and it'll be here after we're gone. You spend 3 more days on Yonaguni. You visit the small museum that displays photographs and models of the formations. You talk with other researchers and enthusiasts who've made the pilgrimage. You learn that everyone has theories, but nobody has proof. You learn that the debate has calcified into entrenched positions, with people choosing sides based as much on philosophical commitments as on empirical evidence. On your last evening, you walk down to the shore at sunset. The water is calm, reflecting orange and purple light. Somewhere below that surface, stone structures sit in arrangements that might be meaningful or might be random. You think about the deeper structure, the one you mapped, still waiting in darkness 2,670 meters down. You think about how much effort people have invested trying to determine what these formations represent. Academic careers have been built on the question. Research funding has been allocated. Thousands of hours of analysis and debate and publication, and the structures remain ambiguous. They refuse to clearly declare their origins. They sit in that uncomfortable space where evidence points in multiple directions, where different interpretive frameworks produce different conclusions, and where certainty remains elusive no matter how much data gets collected. Maybe that's the real story. Not lost civilizations or ancient technologies, but the limits of knowledge. The recognition that some questions might not have clear answers, that ambiguity can persist despite rigorous investigation, and that mystery isn't always solvable through additional research. You return to Phoenix changed in ways you can't quite articulate. The trip didn't provide answers, but it provided perspective. You saw the formations yourself. You talked with people who've spent years studying them. You understand now that the debate will probably continue for decades, that each side has legitimate points, and that the truth might be more complex than either natural formation or artificial construction, might involve some combination of geological processes and human modification that's difficult to untangle from available evidence. Life continues. You find part-time consulting work that keeps you marginally employed without demanding too much attention. You read more, you take up hiking, you maintain your interest in the underwater structures, but with less obsessive focus. They're part of your life, but not the centre of it. In 2012, a new paper gets published analysing wear patterns on the stone surfaces. The researchers use a technique called cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measures how long rock has been exposed to cosmic radiation. The method can determine when the stone was last buried or covered, which might indicate whether the structures were ever above water during lower sea levels. The results are inconclusive. Some surfaces show exposure patterns consistent with having been above water during the last glacial maximum. Other surfaces don't. The pattern makes sense if the structures are natural formations that were sometimes exposed during low sea levels and sometimes submerged during high sea levels. It also makes sense if the structures were built during a low sea level period and then partially modified or maintained during later exposure periods. More ambiguity, more interpretive flexibility. The mystery deepens rather than resolves. You're 61 years old when the next major development occurs. A team from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution announces plans for a comprehensive survey using autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with the latest imaging technology. They're not specifically investigating the structures you mapped, or the formations near Yonaguni. They're conducting a regional survey of the entire seafloor area, mapping geological features and biological habitats as part of a larger study of Pacific Ocean seafloor dynamics. But their survey area includes the coordinates you logged in 1977. The autonomous vehicles will pass directly over the structure, collecting data with resolution far exceeding what any previous survey achieved. The expedition happens in 2015. You follow it online through the Research Institute's public updates. They post maps as the autonomous vehicles complete each survey section. You watch the data accumulate, seeing patterns emerge in the seafloor topography, recognising features from earlier surveys. Then one day, the update includes a note about significant structural formations consistent with previous documented anomalies. They post preliminary images, three-dimensional reconstructions built from acoustic data, showing the structure in detail you've never seen before. The new images reveal complexity that earlier surveys missed. There are multiple structures, not just one. They're arranged in what might be a pattern, oriented along lines that could be meaningful or could be coincidental. The largest structure, the one you mapped, sits at what might be the centre of a larger complex, or might just happen to be surrounded by other geological formations. The research team is careful with their language. They describe the findings as architecturally intriguing formations warranting further investigation. They note the regular proportions, the apparent intentional design, and the difficulty of explaining the patterns through known geological processes, but they don't claim to have found lost cities or ancient civilizations. They present the data and acknowledge the questions it raises without pretending to have definitive answers. Reading the report, you feel a sense of validation mixed with continued uncertainty. You were right that the structure was worth noting. The sonar readings from 1977 represented something genuinely unusual. But being unusual doesn't mean being artificial. The new data raises as many questions as it answers. You're 67 years old now, living quietly in Phoenix, following the ongoing research with the detached interest of someone who has accepted that some mysteries don't resolve neatly. The structure you mapped 42 years ago remains underwater, remains unstudied by direct observation since the 2003 expedition, and remains ambiguous in its origins and purpose. Sometimes you think about writing a memoir, not a grand statement, just a personal account of what it was like to be the person who first noticed something that became a decades-long scientific debate. But you're not sure anyone would care. Your role was minor. You operated sonar equipment and noticed unusual readings. Thousands of other technicians have done the same thing with different results. Your particular readings just happen to persist in importance. The debate about the structures continues. New papers appear occasionally. Graduate students still write dissertations. Online forums still argue interpretations. The divisions have become familiar. Natural formation versus artificial construction. Random coincidence versus intentional design. Geological processes versus human engineering. Both sides have legitimate evidence. Both sides have reasonable arguments. Both sides occasionally overstate their certainty in ways that undermine their credibility with the undecided middle ground. You've stopped hoping for definitive resolution. The structure is what it is. It sits in darkness at 2,670 meters depth, accumulating sediment, hosting blind creatures, and maintaining its secrets through simple ambiguity. Whether people built it or geology formed it, whether it represents lost civilizations or interesting rock formations, it exists independent of human interpretation. That feels important somehow. The structure doesn't need humans to explain it or validate it. It was there before anyone noticed it. It will be there after everyone currently debating it has died. It participates in geological time, moving with plate tectonics, eroding under the gentle pressure of deep ocean currents, and gradually changing in ways that operate on scales humans don't naturally comprehend. You think about how strange it is that a few green lines on a black screen led to 40+ years of investigation and debate. You think about how different your life might have been if you'd been assigned to a different research vessel in 1977, if someone else had been operating the sonar that day, or if the structure had remained unnoticed for another decade or century. But these thoughts lead nowhere productive. What happened, happened. You noticed something unusual. You documented it. Other people followed up. The mystery continues. That's the whole story, and it's enough. Some evenings you look up at the night sky from your apartment balcony, thinking about how much of the universe remains unknown despite our accumulated knowledge. The ocean floors, the distant galaxies, the interior of our own planet. Humans have mapped and measured and analysed enormous portions of reality, but vast expanses remain mysterious. The structure at 2,670 meters is one small piece of that larger mystery. Maybe it's artificial, maybe it's natural, maybe the answer is more complex than either category allows. Maybe we'll never know with certainty, and maybe that's acceptable. Maybe not every mystery needs to be solved. Maybe some things can remain ambiguous, continuing to raise questions without providing answers, existing as reminders that human knowledge has limits, that confidence can be misplaced, and that uncertainty is sometimes the most honest response to complex evidence. You sleep well these days. Your dreams don't feature green lines on black screens anymore, and don't show endless sediment plains or geometric structures rising from darkness. You've made peace with the mystery. You've accepted your minor role in its documentation. You've acknowledged that the satisfaction you sought from the structure's discovery wasn't in finding answers, but in participating, however briefly, in the human project of trying to understand the world. The structure sits in darkness, unchanged by interpretation, indifferent to debate, and that, you've come to believe, is exactly as it should be. Before GPS satellites traced our movements and before Mercator grids divided the world into neat rectangles, someone pressed their palm into wet clay and drew lines that meant something. This is the story of humanity's first attempts to capture the world, not as it appeared from above, but as it felt from within, when every river was a story and every mountain held a name you inherited from your grandmother. You wake up in a world without maps, and for a moment you feel unmoored. Not because you're lost, you know exactly where you are, but because the very concept of where exists differently in your mind than it does in ours. The year is approximately 2500 BCE, and you're sitting near the banks of a river that will one day be called the Euphrates, though that name carries no meaning for you yet. The sun hasn't cleared the reed beds to the east, and the air smells of wet clay and yesterday's cooking fire. Your world exists entirely in memory. When someone asks how to reach the village where your cousin married last summer, you don't envision a route marked in kilometres or degrees. Instead, you remember the way the path feels under your feet, the stretch where loose stones make you watch your step, the place where wild mint grows thick enough to scent your ankles as you pass, and the twisted tamarisk tree where you always stop to rest, because its shade falls just so at midday. These aren't landmarks on a grid. They're characters in a story your body knows by heart. The village elders keep the important knowledge. Old Enlil, named for the storm god but gentle as summer rain, can recite the journey to the obsidian quarries in the northern highlands, a trip that takes 13 days if you're young and unburdened, 17 if you're carrying trade goods. But he doesn't describe it the way you might expect. He talks about sleeping 7 times in valleys and 6 times on ridges. He mentions the spring that tastes faintly of iron, the canyon where eagles nest in pairs, and the meadow where your group will need to decide whether to bear left toward the dangerous pass with better water, or right toward the longer route where wild onions grow. You've never seen this journey yourself, but you could make it if you had to. The knowledge lives in the rhythm of his telling, in the way certain details repeat and anchor themselves in your memory. This is what a map looks like when it exists only in breath and attention. This morning, though, something unusual is happening. The reed worker called Namu, a woman whose fingers can coax river reeds into baskets so tight they hold water, has been given a task by the temple administrators. They want her to create something that preserves memory outside of human minds. The concept alone feels strange, almost sacrilegious. Memory belongs in people, passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child, stored in the architecture of stories and songs. But the temple granaries have grown complex. Barley comes from 17 different farming settlements now, each with its own obligations and yields. The administrators struggle to keep track of which community owes what, which fields lie fallow, and where the irrigation ditches need repair. Someone, nobody remembers who first suggested it, proposed making memory visible. Namu kneads clay between her palms, the same river clay she uses for her basket forms. You watch her face as she works, noting the small crease between her eyebrows that suggests she's solving a problem that has no clear solution. How do you take something as alive and shifting as the known world and press it flat? How do you trap the story of a place in mud? She starts with what she knows, the river. Using her thumb, she draws a long, wavering depression in the clay tablet. It doesn't look much like the Euphrates, too straight in some places, too curved in others, but you recognize it instantly. Not because it's accurate in any measurable sense, but because she's captured something essential about its character. The way it swells and narrows, the personality of its movement. You lean closer, fascinated. To the east of the river line, she presses small circular depressions. Reed beds, you realise. Not every reed bed that exists, but the ones that matter. The dense growth where basket makers harvest in autumn, the shallow marsh where waterfowl nest, and the treacherous soft ground where an unwary traveller might sink to their knees. These aren't geographic features. They're relationships, warnings, and resources. A small boy named Shulgi wanders over, chewing on a reed stem. He's maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed and sunburned, and he looks at Namu's work with the refreshing honesty of someone too young for politeness. "That's not what the river looks like," he announces. Namu doesn't look up from her work. What does the river look like? Shulgi considers this seriously. Big, wet, brown when it floods, blue when it doesn't. Sometimes it has fish. "Can you show me all of that at once?" Namu asks. The boy frowns, recognizing a trap but unsure where it lies. Finally he shakes his head. "Neither can I," Namu says, not unkindly. So I show what matters for remembering. This is the birth of cartography, though nobody will use that word for millennia. This is the moment when human beings first tried to capture space in symbol, and the attempt is necessarily imperfect, necessarily interpretive, and necessarily more poetry than precision. Over the next hours, more people gather to watch. Some offer suggestions: mark where the ferry crosses, note the place where the current runs fast enough to power the grain mill, and show the bend where crocodiles sun themselves on the bank. Each addition reveals what the community values, what they fear, and what they need to remember. The map becomes a document of relationship rather than measurement. You notice something peculiar as the work continues. Nobody bothers to mark the distances between places. When someone suggests adding the temple complex to the clay tablet, they don't debate whether it's the correct scale or properly positioned relative to the river. They simply press a rectangular depression into the clay at a spot that feels right, that preserves the essential truth that the temple sits near the river but on high ground, safe from flooding. An old trader named Namu stops by, leaning heavily on his walking stick. He's travelled more than anyone else in the settlement, venturing south to the salt marshes of the Gulf and north into the foothills where cedar trees grow. He studies Namu's work with the critical eye of someone who's spent decades converting landscape into memory. "You've forgotten the danger," he says finally. "What danger?" "The wilderness beyond our knowing." He taps his stick on the edge of the tablet beyond the marks Namu has made. "Show them that the world has edges, places where our knowledge fails." Namu considers this, then uses a sharp stick to score rough, irregular lines at the margins of the map. Not a border exactly, but a kind of visual static, a way of indicating that beyond these marks lies territory outside the scope of this memory document. Years from now, scholars will puzzle over these marginal scribbles, trying to interpret them as decorative elements, or symbolic representations of mountains or water, but you understand their true purpose. They're an admission of ignorance, a cartographic way of saying, "Here be mysteries." As the sun climbs higher and the clay begins to dry in the heat, you realise you're witnessing something profound. This tablet won't show the world as it would appear to a bird flying overhead or a god looking down from the heavens. It shows the world as it feels to live in it, to walk its paths, to fear its dangers, and to rely on its gifts. The river isn't drawn to scale because its length matters less than its character. The settlements aren't positioned with mathematical precision because their exact coordinates matter less than understanding their relationships to water, to each other, and to the resources that sustain them. Shulgi, who's been watching in patient silence, patient for a 6-year-old anyway, suddenly asks a question that makes several adults chuckle. "If we make the world small enough to fit in your hands, does that mean we understand it?" Namu sets down her tools and really looks at the boy. "No," she says. "It means we've made a tool for remembering what we know and marking what we don't." The distinction matters. This clay tablet won't replace human memory or human storytelling. It won't eliminate the need for elders who carry knowledge in their bones and breath. Instead, it supplements that knowledge, creating a kind of external memory that can persist even when the person who first walked a path has died. It's a technology of preservation, but also a technology of humility, because every mark pressed into clay is simultaneously a claim of knowledge and an admission of limitation. You stay as Namu works into the afternoon, adding and refining, occasionally scraping away a mark that doesn't feel true to the place it represents. Other people come and go, offering their own memories of the landscape, debating the proper way to represent a seasonal spring that flows only during the wet months, and arguing good-naturedly about whether the hill where wild wheat grows deserves marking. What strikes you most is how collaborative the process becomes. This isn't one person's vision of the world, but a collective memory pressed into physical form. Different hands contribute different knowledge. The shepherd notes where predators den. The herbalist marks where medicinal plants cluster. The builder indicates where a good stone can be quarried. The map accumulates these layers of expertise, becoming a document that no single person could have created alone. As evening approaches and long shadows stretch across the settlement, Namu finally sets the tablet aside to finish drying. It's far from complete. Already people are suggesting additional features, corrections and refinements. But it exists. the world has been captured in clay, not as it is, but as it's known, not as measurement, but as meaning. You run your fingers along the edge of the tablet, careful not to disturb the still soft clay. The warmth of the day has been absorbed by the material, and it holds heat like the earth itself. Tomorrow, this tablet might be fired in a kiln, hardening to permanence, or it might simply be allowed to dry in the sun until it becomes stone-like and durable. Either way, it represents a threshold crossed, the moment when human beings decided that the world could be not just remembered but shown. That night, sitting around the communal fire, you listen to the usual stories, the ones about ancestors and heroes, about the time the river flooded so high that fish swam through the streets, and about the proper way to read the stars for planting season. But now you hear them differently, aware that these oral maps exist alongside the clay map drying in Namu's workshop. The two forms of knowledge don't compete. They complement each other, like two languages describing the same essential truth from different angles. Before sleep takes you, you think about that question Shulgi asked. Does making the world small enough to hold mean you understand it? The answer, you realise, is both no and yes. No, because the map is always less than the territory, always a reduction, always an interpretation. But yes, because the attempt to map reveals what you know, and, more importantly, what you don't. The edges of knowledge become visible. The gaps in understanding show themselves. And in that revelation lies the possibility of learning, of expanding the map, of pushing back the margins where Namu drew her marks of mystery. You fall asleep to the sound of the river moving in the darkness, its course invisible but known, its presence a constant that predates maps and will outlast them, flowing through a world that existed long before anyone thought to press its memory into clay. Morning arrives with the particular quality of light that suggests autumn is thinking about arriving. Though summer still holds the days in its warm grip, you find yourself in a different place now, a workshop that smells of wet earth and wood smoke, where pigments ground from minerals and plants sit in small clay vessels, arranged by colour like a sunset laid out in bowls. The mapmaker here is called Ninshubur, and their hands tell the story of decades spent working with materials that resist precision. Calluses ridge the palms. Clay dust has worked its way so deep into the whorls of their fingerprints that it might be permanent. These are hands that understand how river clay differs from upland clay, how moisture content affects malleability, and how quickly different thicknesses dry in a different weather. You watch as Ninshuba prepares a fresh tablet, working the clay with steady pressure, neither hurried nor hesitant. This isn't the first map they've made, probably not even the 50th, and the process has acquired the rhythm of ritual. Add water, knead, test the consistency by pressing a thumb into the mass and watching how quickly the depression holds its shape. Too wet, and the marks will slump and blur. Too dry, and the stylus will drag and tear rather than incise cleanly. The clay has moods, Ninshubur says, noticing your attention. You have to meet it where it is. This isn't a metaphor. Clay gathered in spring, when snowmelt swells the river, contains different sediments than clay gathered in late summer, when the water runs slow and clear. Clay from the East Bank has more sand. Clay from the West has more organic material, tiny fragments of decomposed plants that make it darker and slightly more plastic. A good map maker knows these variations the way a musician knows the particular voice of their instrument. Today's map will document something more complex than the earlier attempts. Trade routes that connect multiple settlements across a region roughly the size of what will one day be called a province. The challenge isn't just spatial, though that's difficult enough, but temporal. These routes change with the seasons. A pass that's navigable in summer becomes choked with snow in winter. A river ford that works in the dry season becomes a deadly crossing when autumn rains swell the current. How do you show time on a two-dimensional surface? How do you map not just where, but when? Ninshubur's solution is layering. First, they press the basic geography into the clay, rivers as wavy lines, settlements as circular depressions, and mountains as triangular marks that slightly rise from the surface. Then comes the innovation. Different colours of pigment will indicate different seasons. Red for summer roots, blue for winter, yellow for spring and autumn, when either path might work depending on that year's weather. The pigments themselves are small miracles of chemistry and patience. The red comes from ochre, iron-rich clay gathered from a specific hillside 3 days' journey north, then roasted in fire until it deepens to the colour of rust. The blue required more invention. Crushed azurite, a copper-based mineral traded from the eastern mountains mixed with gum arabic harvested from acacia trees to help it bind to the clay surface. The yellow is simpler, just more ochre, but raw rather than roasted, producing a shade somewhere between honey and old bone. Ninshuba works with tools you wouldn't necessarily recognise as advanced technology, but which represent generations of refinement. A stylus cut from river reed, its tip kept sharp by frequent trimming. A pointed bone from a bird's wing, perfect for fine detail work. A smooth stone worn concave by years of use, ideal for burnishing clay surfaces to prepare them for pigment. A set of thin wooden strips carved to precise widths, used to maintain consistent thickness when rolling out the clay base. You notice something else. A series of older tablets stacked in one corner of the workshop, each one documenting a previous version of the map now being created. This isn't the first attempt. Map-making has become an iterative process, each generation of cartographers building on the knowledge and mistakes of their predecessors. See this one? Ninshuba lifts an older tablet, its surface worn but still legible. Made by my teacher's teacher. They marked a mountain pass that everyone used for 2 generations. Then an avalanche closed it, maybe 20 years ago. Now we route around. The old map shows the closed pass with the same certainty as the open ones. A confident line, incised deep into the clay, suggesting a permanent feature of the landscape. But landscapes aren't permanent. They shift and change, sometimes gradually, sometimes catastrophically. Rivers alter their courses. Landslides block routes. Settlements grow or disappear. A map that was true yesterday might be dangerously false today. This creates a philosophical problem that Ninshuba clearly wrestles with. Should old maps be destroyed when they become outdated, preventing someone from relying on false information, or preserved as historical documents, evidence of how the world once was? The workshop's collection suggests Ninshuba has chosen preservation, but with a system. Retired maps are marked with a small symbol in the upper left corner, a circle bisected by a wavy line, indicating that the information might no longer be current. As the work continues, you realise you're watching something more than technical craft. You're observing the development of a visual language, a system of symbols that can convey complex information to anyone who learns to read them. A settlement represented by a circle, a walled settlement by a circle with small marks around its perimeter suggesting fortifications. A seasonal camp by a circle with a dotted rather than solid line. The conventions are being invented in real time, negotiated through use, and refined when they prove confusing. A young apprentice named Kubaba arrives carrying a message tablet from one of the trading settlements to the west. She's perhaps 14, old enough to be trusted with valuable communications, but young enough that everything still fascinates her. She sets down the message tablet and immediately gravitates toward the map in progress. "Why is the western mountain blue?" she asks, pointing to a peak that Ninshuba has marked with azure pigment. "It's not blue," Ninshuba says, amused. "Blue means winter. The route over that mountain only opens in summer. But the mountain itself, it is grey rock and snow. But I'm not showing you what colour the mountain is. I'm showing you when you can cross it." Kubaba's face does something complicated. The expression of someone whose understanding is being reorganised at a fundamental level. She's learning to read the map not as a picture, but as a code. The colours don't represent the literal appearance of the landscape. They represent the human relationship to that landscape, the seasonal rhythms that govern access and movement. This is the leap that makes maps powerful and also potentially confusing. They're not meant to be realistic depictions, they're meant to be useful abstractions. The difference matters enormously, though it will take thousands of years before cartographers fully articulate the distinction. Ninshaba returns to work, and you watch the map emerge with the patience that excellence requires. Each symbol is placed with consideration. The spacing between marks is carefully calibrated to suggest relative distances without attempting precise scale. At one point, Ninshaba pauses, stylus hovering over a section of clay, clearly debating something internal. "There's a shrine here," they finally say, speaking to no one in particular. "Small thing, just a stone marker where travellers leave offerings for safe passage. Should it be on the map?" The question hangs in the air. From a purely practical standpoint, a wayside shrine might not seem essential to navigation. But shrines mark places people consider significant. They're waypoints, psychologically, if not geographically. They provide reassurance. You're on the right path, others have passed this way, and the gods are watching. Ninshaba decides to include it, marking the shrine with a small star-like symbol. The choice reveals something about the map's purpose. It's not just documenting physical geography, but sacred geography. The landscape is experienced by people for whom the world is alive with meaning beyond mere terrain. The afternoon grows hot, and Ninshaba works more slowly, giving the clay time to firm up between additions. Too many marks pressed into soft clay too quickly can cause the entire surface to distort, turning precise symbols into illegible smears. Patience isn't just a virtue here, it's a technical requirement. During one of these enforced pauses, Kubaba asks a question that seems simple, but isn't. How do you know where to put things? Ninshaba considers this seriously. Sometimes I know because I've travelled the route myself. Sometimes because someone I trust has told me, and I believe their description. Sometimes because multiple people have told me the same thing, so I trust the consensus. And sometimes... They pause. Sometimes I'm guessing based on how the world usually works. What if you guess wrong? Then someone travels to a place that doesn't exist or can't find a place that does, and they come back angry or confused, and I make a new map with better information. That's how knowledge grows, through mistakes corrected. You find this answer oddly moving. It's an admission that maps are always provisional, always subject to revision, and always dependent on the imperfect knowledge of their makers. Perfect accuracy isn't just unattainable. It might not even be the goal. The goal is usefulness. The goal is helping people move through the world with slightly less uncertainty than they'd have without the map. As evening approaches, Ninshaba applies the last of the pigments, then sets the tablet in a specific spot near the workshop's single window, where tomorrow morning's sun will strike it first and help the colours set. The map will need several days to dry completely, then a careful firing in a low-temperature kiln to make it truly permanent. You study the finished work in the fading light. It's beautiful in its way, this clay rectangle covered with incised lines and daubed colours. But more than beautiful, it's brave. It's an assertion that the world, despite its complexity and constant change, can be partially known, partially captured, and partially shared. Every mark on this tablet represents an act of confidence. I have walked this path, I remember this place, and I can help you find your way. Will it last? You ask, thinking about the fragility of fired clay and how easily it might crack or crumble. Ninshaba shrugs. Long enough, probably. Does it need to last forever? The question catches you off guard. You've been thinking about these maps as attempts at permanence, efforts to preserve knowledge beyond individual human lifespans. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe they're meant to be temporary, useful for a generation or two before conditions change enough that new maps become necessary. Maybe their value lies not in eternal truth, but in present usefulness. That night, you dream of maps dissolving in rain, their careful symbols washing away into illegibility, the accumulated knowledge of careful hands returning to formless mud. But in the dream, this isn't tragic. New hands are already kneading new clay, pressing new marks and adapting the old knowledge to new conditions. The maps die so that mapping can live. You wake with your palms tingling, as if they remember the feeling of wet clay even though you never touched it. As if the craft of map-making has become communicable through observation alone, a kind of knowledge that passes through the eyes and settles somewhere deeper than conscious thought, waiting for the moment when careful hands might need it. The map in front of you this morning is unlike any you've encountered before. You're in what might generously be called a sacred precinct, a small temple complex dedicated to a river goddess, whose name sounds like water moving over stones. The map maker here is both cartographer and priest, roles that nobody bothers to distinguish because they are understood as two aspects of the same calling. This map depicts the same physical region you've been learning, the river valley with its settlements and trade routes, but transformed by layers of theological interpretation. The river itself isn't just represented as a wavy line, it's drawn as a serpent, with scales indicated by careful cross-hatching and eyes marked at the source where the goddess is believed to dwell most strongly. The settlement circles you've come to recognise now have symbols inside them. Some show offerings, some show temples, and one shows what might be a curse or a blessing, depending on how you interpret the viewer-specific symbolism. The priest cartographer is called unhurried. Yes, that name, or a version of it, is the same one that will echo through history attached to the world's first named poet, though this particular person makes maps instead of verses, or maybe maps are just another form of verse. The distinction grows fuzzy here, where the sacred and the practical interweave so tightly that separating them would damage both. You're wondering about the serpent, unhurried says, not looking up from the delicate work of painting tiny scales along the river's length. You admit that yes, the serpent has caught your attention. The river is a serpent, has been for longer than anyone remembers. She sheds her skin every spring when the floods come, leaving rich soil behind. She can be gentle or deadly, depending on her mood. She provides and destroys. What else would she be but a serpent? The logic is airtight within its own frame of reference. You're not looking at metaphor here, not exactly. You're looking at a culture that experiences the divine as completely immanent in the natural world. The river isn't like a goddess, it is a goddess. Mapping the river's geography and mapping the goddess's nature are therefore the same act. But this creates interesting cartographic challenges. How do you represent a river that's simultaneously a physical feature requiring accurate navigation and a divine entity requiring proper respect? How do you balance the practical need to show ford crossings and irrigation channels with the theological need to show places where offerings should be made, or where the goddess's displeasure might manifest as dangerous currents? Unhurried's solution is integration. The map contains multiple layers of information, some practical, some spiritual, but all presented as equally real and equally important. Near the serpent's tail, downstream where the river spreads into marshland before reaching the sea, small symbols indicate fishing grounds, but these same symbols are positioned to suggest where the goddess is most receptive to petitions from fishermen. The map guides both your boat and your prayers. A young temple attendant brings tea, setting it down carefully beside Unhurried's workspace. The map is spread across a larger surface than the portable tablets you've seen before. This one is meant to be permanent, installed in the temple where pilgrims and traders can consult it. The clay is consequently thicker, the firing will be hotter, and the whole thing is designed for durability across generations. Some people think this is wrong, Unhurried says abruptly, still working. Mixing the practical with the sacred. They say maps should show only what you can touch and measure. What do you think? I think those people have never really looked at a river, never watched how it changes moods with the seasons, how it remembers droughts and floods, or how it carries memory in its current. If you only map what you can measure, you miss what's most true. You consider this carefully. There's wisdom in it, but also danger. If every map becomes a theological document, doesn't that make it harder for someone who worships different gods to use the information? If a traveller from a distant land arrives and needs to find their way across the river valley, Will they be able to extract useful navigation from a serpent-scaled map that assumes cultural knowledge they don't possess? Almost as if reading your thoughts, Enheduanna gestures to a second tablet nearby. This one's simpler and more functional. We make both kinds, they explain. The sacred map for those who belong here, who know the river's nature, and the traveller's map for strangers who just need to find their way. But the sacred map is the true one. The other is just a search for words, instructions. The distinction makes sense within its context. The elaborate temple map captures the world as experienced by people who live in a relationship with it, who have emotional and spiritual connections to every marked location. The simplified traveller's map reduces that world to pure function. Here is water, here is shelter, and here are the turns you must make. One tells you what things mean, the other just tells you where they are. As Enheduanna continues working, you notice other theological elements woven into the cartography. The mountains to the north aren't just triangular marks. They're marked with symbols indicating which peaks are home to sky gods, which valleys are sacred to hunting deities, and which passes require offerings before attempting the crossing. This is navigational information of a sort, but it assumes a worldview where propitiating local divinities is as practical a consideration as checking the weather. A merchant arrives seeking permission to consult the map. She's planning a trading expedition and wants to verify the route. Enheduanna waves her over, and you watch as the merchant's eyes scan the Serpent River, clearly seeing past the theological overlay to extract the practical data beneath. She traces a route with her finger, noting where tributaries feed into the main channel where settlements cluster thick enough to promise good trading, and where the map indicates safe camping spots. The blessing marks, she says, pointing to small symbols you hadn't fully understood. Are these the spots where the current is gentle? Enheduanna smiles. The current is gentle where the goddess is peaceful. Same thing. The merchant accepts this with a small nod, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, simply acknowledging that within this cultural framework, theological and physical explanations are two languages describing the same reality. She makes a few notes on a small clay tablet she's brought with her, copying key information, then leaves a small offering at the temple altar before departing. After she's gone, you ask Enheduanna something that's been puzzling you. What happens when the river changes course, when physical reality contradicts the sacred map? The goddess has moved, Enheduanna says simply. The map shows where she is. If she's elsewhere, we update the map. Her nature doesn't change, just her location. This is a remarkably sophisticated theological position wrapped in simple language. It allows for revision and correction without requiring admission of error. The map wasn't wrong, the divine simply shifted. It's a framework that permits adaptation while preserving authority, and you can see how it would make updating maps religiously permissible, even in a culture where challenging sacred texts might be dangerous. The afternoon light shifts, and Enheduanna begins the detailed work of adding what they call story marks, small pictographic sequences that indicate narratives associated with particular locations. Here, a hero crossed the river during a flood to save a child. There, a famous treaty was sealed between rival settlements. Over there, a prophet had a vision that changed local agriculture practices. These aren't geographic features in the conventional sense, but they're landmarks of memory, places made significant by events. You realise you're watching the map become a compressed cultural encyclopedia, a document that contains not just spatial information, but historical, theological and social knowledge. Someone who can read this map fluently doesn't just learn how to navigate the river valley. They learn who they are, who their ancestors were, what their gods demand, and what their culture values. But this richness has a cost. The map has become so culturally specific that it's almost useless to outsiders. A stranger might recognise the river's basic shape, might pick out the settlement markers, but they'd miss most of the meaning. They'd be like someone reading poetry in a language they barely speak, getting some words, missing the music. Do you worry that you're making these maps too complicated, you ask? that they'll become impossible for anyone but specialists to read? Enheduanna considers this for a long moment. Maybe, but better a map that tells the truth completely to a few people than one that gives everyone a simplified lie. The world is complicated. Maps that pretend otherwise are the dangerous ones. You're not entirely convinced. Simplification isn't necessarily lying. It's choosing which truth to emphasize for a particular purpose. A traveller's map that omits theological details isn't claiming the gods don't exist. It's just focusing on the information that particular user needs. But you can appreciate Enheduanna's position. For them, divorcing geography from belief would be like mapping the human body while omitting the organs. Technically possible, but missing what makes the thing alive. As evening approaches, Enheduanna begins the final touches, adding small dots of white pigment made from crushed shells to indicate sacred springs, using red ochre to mark sites where blood offerings are appropriate, and drawing careful spirals at the boundaries between territories governed by different deity aspects of the river goddess. Each addition layers meaning onto meaning, building a document that is simultaneously a map, a religious text, a historical record, and a cultural manifesto. When it's finally finished, you stand back to take in the whole composition. It's breathtaking and bewildering, beautiful and confusing. The Serpent River dominates, coiling across the clay surface with undeniable presence. Around it, human settlements cluster like offerings, connected by trade routes that double as pilgrimage paths. The mountains loom, home to powers that must be acknowledged, and everywhere, tiny marks and symbols add depth and nuance, whispering stories to those who know how to listen. Will people in the future understand this, you ask? Enheduanna shrugs. Will people in the future understand us? Maps are like language. You need the key to unlock them. Someday, maybe, someone will find this and see only clay and colour, no meaning. Or maybe they'll be smart enough to recognise a masterpiece of integrated knowledge. Either way, we made it true to how we experience the world. That's all we can do. That night, lying in the darkness, you think about the relationship between belief and perception, between the world as it is and the world as we understand it. Every map is an argument about reality, a claim about what matters and what can be ignored, what's essential and what's ornamental. Sacred maps don't hide this fact. They make it explicit, acknowledging that all observation is interpretation, all representation is choice. You dream of serpent rivers and god mountains, of a landscape where every rock has a name and every name has a story, where you can't separate the geography from the meaning because they are woven together too tightly to tear apart. When you wake, you're not sure if you've been dreaming or remembering, whether the map you saw was external or internal, or whether any difference between those categories truly exists. You find yourself walking a familiar path, though the season has shifted. Winter is approaching, bringing cold winds that carry the smell of distant snow. The journey takes you to a settlement nestled in foothills, where people understand landscape primarily through the network of relationships that sustain them. Here, the map you're about to witness is being created not by a single artisan, but by a council of people whose combined knowledge forms a more complete picture than any individual could produce. The gathering happens in a large common building, warmed by a central hearth where embers glow like small suns. 8 people sit in a rough circle, and in the centre, on a smooth wooden board covered with damp clay, a map slowly emerges through conversation and negotiation. The first speaker is an elderly shepherd whose face suggests a lifetime of weather. The highland pasture, she begins, pressing her thumb into the clay to create a circular depression, is where the summer grazing is good, but only after the snow melts, and only if you can negotiate with the clans who claim it from the other side. This single mark contains layers of information: seasonal availability, resource quality, and political complexity. The pasture isn't just a place, it's a summer relationship, a shared territory requiring diplomacy as much as navigation. A younger man, a hunter, adds his knowledge. The game trails cross here and here, he marks 2 lines with a thin stick. but the deer change their routes depending on water availability. In wet years, they come down early. Dry years, they stay high longer. You notice that he's not drawing the trails as fixed features, but as tendencies, possibilities that shift based on conditions. The map is accumulating conditional knowledge. If this, then that. It's less a snapshot and more a field guide to probabilities. A woman who gathers medicinal plants speaks next. The healing herbs cluster near the 3 springs, but the middle spring sometimes dries up in late summer, so you can't rely on it. She makes 3 small marks, then adds a symbol beside one to indicate its unreliability. What fascinates you is how this council-created map emphasises connections over locations. The highland pasture matters because of its relationship to the settlement, distance, to the seasons, timing, to neighbouring clans, politics, and to the shepherd's livelihood, personal stakes. Every mark on the clay refers not just to a geographic feature, but to a web of relationships radiating from that feature. An older trader contributes routes, but he describes them in terms of relationships between settlements, rather than abstract paths through empty space. From here to the river, Ford is a 2-day journey with loaded pack animals, but you have to stop at the halfway camp where Mikhail's family welcomes traders in exchange for news. They're expecting you. If you don't stop, they'll be offended, and that makes future journeys harder. This isn't just logistical information, it's social instruction. The map is documenting a relationship network as much as a geographic one. The route isn't just the physical path, it's the social obligation to maintain connections with people along the way. A younger woman, perhaps 30, speaks hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The northern ridge has changed since the landslide 3 winters ago. The old trail is gone. We've cut a new one, but it's steep in places. My daughter almost fell last spring. Mark it as dangerous for children. Her contribution is immediately accepted, and the clay is revised to show the new reality. The map adapts, incorporating recent information without questioning the speaker's authority. Everyone here understands that landscape knowledge is earned through lived experience, and this woman's near loss of her daughter has given her expertise that demands respect. Throughout the discussion, disagreements arise, but they're negotiated with remarkable patience. When 2 people describe different routes to the same destination, both routes are marked, with small symbols indicating which is faster, which is safer, which offers better water sources, and which is passable only in certain seasons. The map grows complex, sometimes confusing, but undeniably comprehensive. An old man with gnarled hands, a stoneworker who's spent decades quarrying building material from local outcrops, adds his knowledge of the physical landscape. The good granite is here, he indicates a location on the northern edge of the mapped area, but the overhang is unstable. We lost 2 men there, maybe 20 years back. People should know before they go cutting stone. His addition is both practical and memorial. The mark on the map honours the dead while protecting the living, transforming tragedy into transmitted wisdom. The landscape carries memory, and the map helps that memory persist beyond individual recall. As the mapping session continues, you begin to understand something fundamental about how these people conceptualize space. They don't think in terms of Cartesian coordinates or geometric precision. They think in terms of journeys and experiences, of relationships and obligations, of seasonal rhythms and social debts. The question isn't where is it, but rather how do you reach it, and what do you need to know before you try? A middle-aged woman, a weaver who trades finished cloth for raw materials, contributes information about the valley settlements to the south. But she doesn't just mark their locations. She indicates which communities prefer which colours, which settlements pay in grain versus livestock, and which families are related through marriage and therefore might offer better trading terms to someone they perceive as connected to their kin network. The map is becoming a document of economic relationships, kinship ties, political alliances, and personal histories, all overlaid on basic geography. To someone from outside this cultural context, it would be nearly impossible to extract useful information. But to these people, every mark resonates with meaning, activating memories and knowledge that the map itself only partially contains. Halfway through the afternoon, someone brings food, bread, cheese and dried fruit, and the mapping pauses for shared eating. The break isn't a distraction from the work. It's part of the work, a reminder that map-making is a social act, that knowledge creation happens through community consensus, rather than individual authority. During the meal, the youngest person present, a boy of perhaps 12 named Kieran, asks a question that makes several adults smile. Why don't we just write down everything we know in words? Why make pictures in clay? The elderly shepherd answers gently, "Try this. Close your eyes and tell me how to get from your house to the highland pasture using only words." Kieran closes his eyes and begins describing the route. Go out the north door, turn left, follow the stream until... He falters, struggling to convert visual memory into linear language. Maps help us see it all at once, the shepherd explains. They show relationships that are hard to capture in sequences of words, everything connected to everything else, visible together. This is a profound insight about cognitive tools. Maps leverage spatial memory, allowing the human mind to perceive patterns and relationships that would be obscured by purely verbal description. You can see the whole territory at once, grasp the spatial logic, and understand how parts relate to the whole. After eating, the council returns to work with renewed focus. Now they're adding what they call wisdom marks, symbols indicating places associated with specific knowledge or cautionary tales. A mark shows where a famous elder once predicted a flood by reading subtle signs in the landscape. Another indicates a spot where unusual weather patterns regularly form, creating local conditions different from the surrounding area. A third marks where a particular type of clay can be dug that's perfect for pottery, but toxic if ingested. Each wisdom mark comes with a story, and you realise the map is designed to trigger storytelling. An elder teaching a young person to navigate this landscape would use the map as a prompt, allowing each symbol to open into a narrative explanation. The map isn't meant to replace oral knowledge transmission, it's meant to enhance it, providing a visual framework that supports and organises spoken wisdom. As evening approaches and the light begins to fail, someone brings oil lamps, and the work continues by flickering light. The map is nearly complete now, dense with information, almost overwhelming in its detail, yet somehow it remains coherent, because everyone involved shares the cultural knowledge needed to decode the symbols, to recognise the conventions, and to read between the lines. The final act is blessing the map. The oldest person present, a woman so elderly her age has become uncertain, but whose memory reaches back further than anyone else's, places her palm flat on the clay and speaks words you don't fully understand. They sound like prayer but also like naming, as if by touching the represented landscape she's linking the map to the territory, creating a kind of sympathetic magic between the image and the reality. When her hand lifts, it leaves a perfect print in the clay, the lines of her palm and the creases of her fingers unique as identity. The others murmur approval. The handprint will remain, fired into permanence, a signature that says this knowledge was touched by human hands, created by human minds, and blessed by human wisdom. Will this map last? You ask the same question you've asked before, but here it feels different. The weaver answers, long enough for our children to learn from it, to add their knowledge, and to make better maps when our world changes. That's all we need. You study the finished map in the lamplight. It's not beautiful in any conventional sense. Too cluttered, too dense with overlapping symbols, too specific to its cultural moment. But it's honest. It shows the world as relationships, which is perhaps the most accurate representation possible. Because what is a landscape really, except a network of connections between people, places, resources, dangers, and memories? That night, sleeping in a guest house with the wind rattling the shutters, You dream of walking through the mapped landscape. In the dream, every marked location speaks when you approach, telling its story, explaining its significance. The map has become three-dimensional, temporal, and animated by the knowledge of everyone who contributed to its creation. You walk trails that are simultaneously physical paths and social obligations, cross rivers that are both water and boundary, and climb mountains that are both rock and sacred presence. When you wake, the dream logic persists for a moment, and you understand something essential. All maps are dreams of mastery, attempts to make the overwhelming complexity of the world manageable through representation, but the best maps know their dreams. They acknowledge their incompleteness, their subjectivity, and their necessary distortions. They serve truth by admitting they're not the truth, only a tool for approaching it. You find yourself in a strange position, observer of an observation, archaeologists from a distant land, people who speak a different language and worship different gods, have discovered an ancient map in the ruins of a long-abandoned settlement. The map is perhaps 200 years old, created by a culture that no longer exists in recognizable form, and these scholars are attempting to interpret what they've found. The map itself is impressive. A large clay tablet, well preserved by the dry climate, covered with symbols and marks that clearly represent some kind of geographic information. But the original context has been lost. Nobody alive speaks the language that might explain the symbols. No living tradition preserves the knowledge of what specific marks meant. You watch as the chief archaeologist, a careful, methodical woman named Dr. Sarai, examines the map through the lens of her own culture's cartographic traditions. She recognizes the wavy lines as probably representing a river. The circular marks might be settlements. The triangular symbols could be mountains. So far, so good. But then the interpretations grow more speculative. The map includes colour variations, areas marked in red, blue, and yellow. And Dr. Sarai assumes these indicate different political territories, like the colour-coded maps her culture uses to show kingdoms and provinces. Here, she points, is clearly the border between the Red Kingdom and the Blue. See how the colours meet but don't overlap? Except that's not what the colours mean at all. You know, because you've witnessed this map's creation in an earlier time. The colours indicate seasons, red for summer roots, blue for winter, and yellow for spring and autumn. The map isn't showing political divisions in space, it's showing temporal availability. The entire interpretation is backwards, but Dr. Sarai has no way to know this. She's reading the map through the only framework she has available, her own culture's cartographic conventions, and by those conventions her interpretation makes perfect sense. The mistake isn't stupidity, it's the inevitable result of trying to decode one culture's symbol system using another culture's key. A younger scholar named Marcus examines the serpent-shaped river and offers his interpretation. Clearly decorative. The mapmaker was adding artistic flourishes to make the document more impressive, perhaps for a royal patron. The scales are just ornamental detail. You want to laugh or cry or both. The serpent isn't decorative. It's theological, representing the river as a divine entity. But to Marcus, who comes from a culture where maps are purely functional documents, the idea that cartography might serve spiritual purposes doesn't occur to him. He's not wrong to find the interpretation difficult. He's simply missing the conceptual framework that would make it obvious. The team continues their analysis, growing more confident as they identify patterns and make connections. They notice that some settlement markers are larger than others, and conclude this indicates population size or political importance. Actually, the size differences indicate something else entirely. The larger marks show settlements where the map's creators had family connections, places of personal significance rather than objective metropolitan scale. They catalogue the wisdom marks as probably representing resources or dangers. Not entirely wrong, but missing the narrative dimension, the way each symbol is meant to trigger a specific story that contains nuanced knowledge. The handprint at the map's edge particularly puzzles them. One scholar suggests it's a signature, while another proposes it might be a symbolic representation of creation or divine authorization. Both interpretations have merit, but both also miss the mark. The handprint is blessing, memory and authentication all at once, a way of saying this knowledge passed through these hands that can't be adequately captured by any single explanation the scholars propose. What's fascinating is watching how the archaeologists construct an entirely coherent interpretation based on incomplete information and cultural bias. Their reading of the map makes perfect sense within their framework. They're not being foolish or careless. They're doing exactly what any intelligent person would do, using available evidence and known patterns to construct plausible explanations. The tragedy is that their well-reasoned conclusions are largely wrong. Dr. Sarai develops an elaborate theory about the map representing a trade network between rival kingdoms, with the coloured zones indicating spheres of influence and the various symbols marking trading posts, defensive fortifications and resource extraction sites. She presents this interpretation to her colleagues with careful argumentation, supporting each claim with evidence from the map itself. The evidence does support her interpretation if you accept her premises. The problem is that the premises are wrong, rooted in assumptions about what maps are for and how they function that simply don't apply to this particular document. One evening, you observe a fascinating argument between Dr. Sarai and Marcus about a series of small marks clustered near one section of the river. Dr. Sarai believes they indicate multiple settlements in close proximity, suggesting a region of high population density. Marcus thinks they are symbolic representations of productive agricultural land. Neither considers that the marks might indicate fishing grounds, shrine locations, and places where specific medicinal plants grow, a clustering of resources rather than people or fields. The concentration here, Dr. Sarai argues, pointing to the cluster, suggests this was the cultural and economic heart of the civilization that created this map. Probably the capital city or at least a major population centre. Marcus counters, or the breadbasket that fed the civilization. Agricultural surplus is what allows complex societies to develop. This concentration of marks could represent the farmland that sustained the culture. They're both applying frameworks from their own era, where concentrated settlement or intensive agriculture would indeed be marked prominently on maps. They're not wrong to think this way. They're just thinking about the wrong kind of map. The misunderstandings multiply. The archaeologists completely miss the conditional nature of many marks, interpreting variant routes as representing different time periods, rather than different seasons or different purposes. They struggle with the theological overlay, alternately dismissing sacred elements as primitive superstition, or over-interpreting them as evidence of religious warfare between competing cult centres. At one point, a graduate student named Leah tentatively suggests that maybe the map represents something other than political geography, perhaps ecological knowledge or seasonal patterns. The senior scholars acknowledge this as an interesting thought, but ultimately dismiss it as unlikely, because maps, in their experience, primarily serve political and military purposes. The idea that a culture might invest significant resources in mapping seasonal resource availability strikes them as improbable. You watch this dismissal with a mixture of amusement and frustration. Leah was closer to the truth than her mentors, but her insight got overruled by their greater experience with a completely different cartographic tradition. The team eventually publishes their findings, a detailed analysis of what they interpret as a political-economic map from an ancient civilization, showing territorial divisions, trade routes and population centres. They acknowledge uncertainties and gaps in their interpretation, maintaining appropriate scholarly caution about claims made from limited evidence. The work is professional, thorough, and substantially incorrect. Years later, you imagine, other scholars might revisit this map with new frameworks, proposing alternative interpretations. Some might be closer to the original meaning, others might drift even further afield. The map will accumulate layers of scholarly interpretation like sediment, each generation reading it through their own cultural lenses, finding in it reflections of their own assumptions about what maps are and how they work. This is the paradox of archaeological interpretation. We can only understand the past through the conceptual tools of the present, but those tools are often inadequate to the task. We modernize the ancient, make it familiar, and force it into categories that help us process it but also distort its original nature. The night before the archaeological team leaves the site, you overhear Dr. Sarai and Marcus having a more philosophical conversation over evening tea. Dr. Sarai muses about the limits of their knowledge. We'll never really know what this map meant to the people who made it. We can make educated guesses and build plausible interpretations, but the original context is lost. All we can do is be honest about our uncertainty, Marcus agrees, adding, "Maybe that's okay though. Maybe every generation needs to interpret the past through their own lens. Our reading of this map says as much about us as it does about them." It's a moment of unexpected wisdom, acknowledging that interpretation is always a conversation between past and present, always shaped by the interpreter as much as the interpreted. They're wrong about the map's specifics, but right about the broader epistemological point. Perfect understanding across cultural and temporal distance might be impossible. All we can do is try our best and admit our limitations. You think about the original map makers, the council that spent days creating this document, embedding it with layers of meaning that will never be fully recovered. Their careful work has been misunderstood, reinterpreted, and forced into alien frameworks. Is this tragedy? Or is it just the inevitable fate of all human communication across sufficient distance? Maybe both. The map survives and carries some meaning forward, even if that meaning has mutated in transmission. The archaeologists learn something, even if not exactly what the map makers intended to teach. Knowledge persists, imperfectly but persistently, adapting to new context because perfect preservation is impossible. As you drift towards sleep that night, you imagine a future even more distant, where Dr. Sarai's published interpretation itself becomes an archaeological artifact, studied by scholars trying to understand early 21st century archaeological methods. They'll find her work quaint, limited by the conceptual frameworks of her era, and making assumptions that seem obvious to them will seem bizarre. And they too will be partly right and partly wrong, reading the past through the only lens available, their own present. The map outlasts all its interpreters, silent and patient, meaning whatever each generation needs it to mean, carrying forward fragments of truth wrapped in layers of misunderstanding, neither entirely lost nor fully preserved, existing in the twilight space between past intention and present interpretation, where all historical knowledge lives. The excavation happens slowly, with the patience that archaeology demands. You're observing a different site now, in a different era, where a team of modern researchers is carefully exposing an ancient archive. Among the clay tablets and ceramic fragments, they found something unexpected, a collection of early maps, preserved by a fortunate collapse that buried them in airless conditions before fire or water could destroy them. The site director is a patient man named Dr. Ishan, whose hands shake slightly with excitement as he photographs each tablet in situ before moving it. "We thought this was just a granary complex," he explains to his team. "Storage for surplus grain, maybe some administrative records. But this," he gestures to the mapped tablet still half buried in sterile soil, "this changes everything. The maps are diverse, created over what must be several generations. Some are simple and functional, showing basic geographic relationships. Others are elaborate, dense with symbolic meaning that will take years to decode. Together they constitute an archive of geographic knowledge from a culture that has been dead for millennia." The excavation proceeds with excruciating slowness. Each tablet must be documented in place, photographed from multiple angles, and carefully removed with tools that wouldn't look out of place in a surgeon's kit. The soil around each map is collected for analysis. Maybe it will contain pollen or other organic material that helps date the artifacts or understand their context. A young graduate student named Amara has been assigned to create preliminary sketches of each map as it's exposed, capturing the symbols and marks before the tablets are moved to the conservation lab. You watch her work crouched in the dusty trench, translating three-dimensional artifacts into two-dimensional drawings with painstaking accuracy. "This one's different," she says, studying a tablet that's just been fully exposed. "See how the river line has these small marks along it? Not like the others." "Doctor." Ishan crouches beside her, careful not to disturb the artifact. "Could be settlements, could be shrines, could be something we haven't thought of yet." He smiles at his own ignorance, clearly delighted by the puzzle. The team begins to recognise patterns across the map collection. Several tablets show the same basic region but with variations, different symbols, different emphasis, and sometimes quite different spatial relationships. At first, this seems like a contradiction. Which map is accurate? But gradually they realise they're not looking at errors but at different purposes. One map emphasises water sources, another focuses on agricultural zones, a third seems to show sacred sites and pilgrimage routes. They weren't trying to make one perfect map, Amara realises. They were making specialised maps for different uses, like how we have road maps and topographic maps and political maps, all showing the same place but highlighting different information. This insight shifts their interpretation of the entire archive. Instead of primitive attempts at a single true representation, they're seeing a sophisticated culture that understood maps as purpose-built tools, created differently depending on intended use. It's evidence of cartographic sophistication that nobody expected from this time period and region. The conservation lab receives the tablets like precious patience. Each one is cleaned with tools and techniques that would seem absurd if the artifacts weren't so valuable. Soft brushes, distilled water applied drop by careful drop, and hours of patient work to remove millennia of accumulated dirt without damaging the underlying surface. As the maps are cleaned, details emerge that weren't visible in the field. Colours that seemed faded prove to be vibrant under proper lighting. Symbols that appeared to be simple marks reveal themselves as complex pictographs when examined under magnification. The maps are more information-dense than the excavation team initially realised. Dr. Ishan's team expands to include specialists in ancient languages, religious historians, geographers who can identify features in the ancient landscape that still exist today, and even anthropologists who study how different cultures conceptualise space. The maps have become a multidisciplinary research project, each expert bringing different frameworks for interpretation. A breakthrough comes from an unlikely source. Dr. Elena, a scholar of ancient irrigation systems, recognises a pattern in how water is represented across multiple maps. "These aren't natural waterways," she explains, pointing to a network of carefully marked lines on one tablet. "These are irrigation channels, and these marks here, these might indicate sluice gates or control points." Her insight opens new lines of inquiry. If the maps show irrigation infrastructure, they might also indicate the political organisation required to build and maintain such systems. Irrigation requires coordination, which requires authority, which means these maps might contain embedded information about social hierarchy and governance. Another scholar, Dr. James, specialises in archaeoastronomy. He notices that several maps include marks that don't correspond to any obvious geographic features. "What if these aren't maps of Earth at all?" he suggests. "What if some of these tablets map the sky?" The team examines the relevant tablets more carefully and confirms his hypothesis. Mixed in with the geographic maps are several celestial charts, showing constellations and planetary positions. The ancient mapmakers apparently didn't distinguish sharply between mapping Earth and mapping heaven. Both were aspects of understanding and navigating the cosmos. The archive continues to reveal surprises. One tablet, initially dismissed as too damaged for useful analysis, proves under careful restoration to contain what might be the earliest known attempt at showing scale. Small marks along one edge appear to be a measuring system, some kind of standardized unit that allowed users to estimate actual distances from the represented distances on the map. "If this is what I think it is, Doctor, Ishan says, examining the restored tablet with barely contained excitement, "They were thinking about scale 3,000 years ago. That's earlier than any other evidence we have for this kind of mathematical cartography." Not everyone on the team agrees with his interpretation. Some argue the marks might be decorative or perhaps represent something other than measurement. The debate continues, civil but intense, with each side marshalling evidence and argumentation. This is science at its best. People following evidence toward truth while acknowledging uncertainty. As months turn into years, a clearer picture of the ancient map-making culture emerges. They were agriculturalists living in a river valley, dependent on complex irrigation for survival. They engaged in long-distance trade, travelled seasonal routes to access different resources, and maintained relationships with neighbouring groups that ranged from cooperative to hostile. They had a rich spiritual life that saw divinity in landscape features. They valued knowledge preservation enough to invest significant resources in creating permanent records. The maps themselves become characters in academic papers and conference presentations. Scholars argue about their interpretation, propose new readings of ambiguous symbols, and debate the cultural values embedded in cartographic choices. The tablets that once sat silent in darkness now spark conversations across continents, connecting researchers who will never meet the people who created these artifacts, but who feel a strange intimacy with them nonetheless. Public interest follows academic discovery. The maps are featured in museum exhibitions, photographed for textbooks, and reproduced in popular science articles. People who've never thought about ancient cartography find themselves fascinated by these clay rectangles covered with marks that represent a vanished world. You observe one such exhibition, watching visitors move past glass cases containing the displayed maps. Most people pause only briefly, unable to fully grasp what they're seeing without extensive context. But a few linger, studying the symbols, trying to decode the meaning, feeling some connection across millennia to the hands that press these marks into wet clay. A child asks her parent what the maps are for, and the parent reads the placard text. These maps helped ancient people navigate their world and preserve knowledge for future generations. It's a simplified explanation, but essentially accurate. The child nods, satisfied, and moves on to the next exhibit. That night, in a research library half a world away, Dr. Shan works late on a comprehensive publication about the map archive. He's trying to write in a way that's accessible to educated readers while maintaining scholarly rigour, trying to convey both what they know and what remains uncertain, and trying to honour the intelligence and sophistication of the ancient mapmakers while acknowledging the enormous gaps in modern understanding. It's harder than he expected. The maps resist simple explanations. They contain depths that reveal themselves gradually, that require patient attention and willingness to question assumptions. They're teaching him humility, these ancient tablets, reminding him that human intelligence and creativity aren't recent innovations but ancient inheritances. He writes, "These maps challenge our assumptions about primitive and advanced, about the linear progression of human knowledge. They suggest that sophistication and simplicity can coexist, that technological limitation doesn't imply intellectual poverty." The people who made these maps thought carefully about representation and abstraction, about how to capture complexity in limited media, and about what knowledge matters enough to preserve. The words feel inadequate, but he continues writing, trying to build a bridge between the ancient map makers and modern readers, knowing the bridge will always be imperfect, but hoping it might carry some traffic nonetheless. As you watch him work, you think about the strange journey these maps have taken, from hands that shaped them with purpose and care, through millennia of darkness and forgetting, into laboratories and museums where they're studied and preserved and misunderstood, and partly understood and valued in ways their creators never imagined. The maps have outlasted the civilization that produced them, the language that explained them, and the cultural context that made them fully meaningful. They persist as fragments, eloquent but incomplete, speaking a language that requires translation and interpretation and imagination to access. And yet they speak. They carry forward something essential about human beings' need to understand and represent their world, to create tools for navigation and knowledge preservation, and to leave marks that say, I was here, I knew this, and I wanted you to know it too. The quiet rediscovery continues, patient and ongoing, probably eternal. Each generation will find something different in these ancient maps, will ask new questions and develop new interpretations, and will see reflections of their own concerns and interests. The maps will never be fully understood, but they'll never be exhausted either. They'll keep offering insights, puzzles, and connections across time. You leave Dr. Ishan to his writing and step outside into the night. The stars are sharp and clear, mapping the sky above as ancient cartographers once mapped it below, unchanged in pattern if not in meaning, still guiding travellers as they have for all of human history, still teaching the lesson that maps have always taught. The world is large and we are small, but understanding is possible, and the attempt to understand is what makes us human. You find yourself in a peculiar space, not quite past, not quite present, but somewhere between memory and imagination, where the map you've been following through these chapters finally reveals its full nature. This is the oldest map on Earth, though calling it old seems wrong. It was new once, revolutionary even, created by minds as sharp and creative as any that followed. The tablet sits on a simple pedestal, lit by indirect sunlight filtering through windows you can't quite see. You're alone with it, finally able to look without the mediation of archaeologists or priests or traders or anyone else's interpretation. Just you and the clay and the marks pressed into it thousands of years ago by hands that have long since returned to dust. The first thing that strikes you is how confident the marks are. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Someone knew exactly what they were doing when they created this. The lines are deliberate, the symbols carefully placed, and the overall composition balanced despite its apparent simplicity. This isn't primitive work. It's economical work, creating maximum meaning with minimum means. You begin to trace the elements, reading them not for what they show, but for what they reveal about the thinking that created them. The river dominates because the river dominated life in that place and time. Its serpentine form isn't decorative or superstitious. It's essential truth captured in visual metaphor. The river is alive, changeable, and powerful. How else would you represent that except as a living thing? The settlement markers vary in size not because the map maker couldn't maintain consistency, but because consistency wasn't the goal. Size indicates importance, but importance is measured by relationship and meaning rather than objective population. The large marks show places that mattered to the map maker and their community. The small marks show places that existed but held less significance in the network of care and connection that made life possible. The symbols scattered across the tablet, each one a condensed packet of knowledge, aren't primitive attempts at more sophisticated notation. They're sophisticated attempts at maximum information density using available technology. Each symbol can trigger extensive knowledge in someone who shares the cultural context. They're mnemonic devices, memory aids, and keys that unlock whole libraries of orally transmitted wisdom. You notice details you've overlooked before. The clay itself varies in texture across the tablet's surface, smoother in some areas, rougher in others. This might be intentional, using tactile variation to encode additional information, allowing the map to be partially read through touch as well as sight. A map for fingertips as well as eyes. The edges of the tablet show wear patterns suggesting frequent handling. This wasn't created and then archived. It was used, consulted and touched by many hands over years or decades. The wear adds its own kind of meaning. This knowledge mattered, this map served a real purpose, and these marks guided actual journeys and decisions. You find yourself thinking about the word primitive, which scholars will eventually apply to maps like this. The word suggests simplicity, naivety, and the early fumbling attempts that precede more advanced work. But nothing about this map is fumbling. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do, and doing it with elegant efficiency. The map makers understood constraints. They knew clay imposed limitations. It couldn't capture fine detail like parchment, couldn't be easily amended like chalk on slate, and couldn't be reproduced like a printing press would someday allow. So they worked within those constraints, making choices that optimize for durability, information density, and usability given available materials. They understood purpose. This map wasn't trying to be objective or comprehensive. It was trying to be useful to specific people for specific purposes. Objectivity was less important than relevance. Comprehensiveness was less valuable than focused utility. These aren't failings. They're design decisions and sophisticated ones. They understood symbolism. The marks on this tablet operate at multiple levels simultaneously. They're literal, this line is the river. Metaphorical, this line is the goddess. And functional, this line shows where to find water, all at once. The map makers weren't confused about these different levels. They were integrating them, understanding that human relationship to landscape is always multidimensional. They understood time. Many elements of the map encode temporal information, seasonal availability, the sequence of waypoints on a journey, and the cycle of flooding and drought. The map isn't a snapshot of a single moment, but a representation of patterns that recur, knowledge that remains valid across time because it captures regularities rather than ephemeral conditions. Most impressively, they understood limits. The rough marks at the map's edges, the areas left blank, and the symbols that indicate uncertainty or danger. All of these acknowledge that knowledge is incomplete, that the known world has boundaries, and that honesty requires admitting ignorance. The map doesn't pretend omniscience. It clearly delineates between this we know and this we don't. You think about how this will be received when archaeologists eventually discover it. They'll measure it against their own cartographic standards and find it wanting. They'll note its lack of scale, its distorted proportions, and its mixing of pragmatic and symbolic elements. They'll use words like crude and rudimentary, and yes, primitive. But they'll be wrong, or at least incomplete in their judgment. They'll be evaluating the map against criteria it was never trying to meet and purposes it wasn't designed to serve. It's like criticising a knife for being a poor hammer. The criticism reveals more about the critic's expectations than the tool's quality. This map is sophisticated in ways that will take centuries for cartography to rediscover. It understands that all representation is interpretation. It acknowledges that objectivity is impossible and perhaps undesirable. It prioritizes usefulness over accuracy, meaning over measurement, and relationship over geometric precision. These are lessons that modern cartography will eventually relearn, but only after a long detour through the fantasy of perfect objective representation. You notice something else, the handprint pressed into the clay near the edge. You've thought about this before, but now it takes on new significance. That handprint is a signature, yes, but it's also a declaration. A human made this. Human knowledge, human effort, and human care went into these marks. The map isn't trying to be God's eye view or some impossible objective truth. It's explicitly, unapologetically human, limited, subjective, and situated, but nonetheless valuable. The afternoon light shifts, changing how shadows fall across the tablet's surface. Marks that were invisible moments ago suddenly appear. Others recede into shadow. The map is revealing itself gradually, refusing to be fully known in a single glance. It has depths. You think about all the maps that will follow this one, the increasingly elaborate attempts to capture the world in parchment and paper, and eventually pixels. Many will be more accurate in the measurable sense. None will be more true in the deeper sense of capturing how it feels to live in a landscape, to depend on its resources, to fear its dangers, and to carry its knowledge in your body as well as your mind. The tablet before you isn't a primitive precursor to better maps. It's a different kind of map entirely, serving different purposes with different assumptions about what mapping means. Later cartography won't surpass this so much as diverge from it, pursuing different goals that require different methods. This map and its descendants in the Western cartographic tradition will eventually part ways so completely that they'll be nearly incomparable. One tradition will value precision, scale, and objective representation of measurable features. The other would have continued valuing relationship, meaning the integration of physical and spiritual geography. Both are valid. Both serve real purposes. Neither is primitive. Neither is advanced. They're different solutions to different problems. As the light continues to change, you make a final observation. The map is beautiful. Not in the sense of artistic achievement or aesthetic perfection, but in the sense of fitness to purpose, elegance of solution, and honest representation of complex reality. It's beautiful the way a well-made tool is beautiful, the way a perfectly functional object achieves grace through pure utility. You step back, taking in the whole tablet one last time. Somewhere someone is pressing marks into wet clay, creating tomorrow's ancient map, preserving today's knowledge for a future they'll never see. The work continues, the human need to understand and represent and preserve. The technology changes, the impulse remains constant. The oldest map on Earth is trying to tell you this. Human beings have always been intelligent, always been creative, and always been capable of sophisticated thought and careful work. The tools change, the media evolve, but the fundamental human capacities to observe, to remember, to symbolize, to preserve, to transmit, these are ancient beyond reckoning. Before this map was called primitive, it was called essential. Before it was a curiosity in a museum case, it was a tool for survival. Before archaeologists puzzled over its meaning, travellers consulted it for life-saving information. Before scholars debated its sophistication, it was simply the best available technology for solving a critical problem. The map endures not despite its age, but because of its fundamental soundness. It did what it needed to do, it served its purpose, it captured knowledge and transmitted it across generations. What more can any map aspire to? You turn away finally, leaving the tablet to its eternal patience. It will be here when you return, when anyone returns, silent and eloquent, waiting to teach anyone willing to learn the lesson it's been teaching, since the moment those careful hands pressed the final marks into damp clay and set it aside to dry. The lesson about human capability and creativity, and the eternal need to make sense of the world we inhabit, to map not just where we are but who we are, not just the geography of Earth, but the geography of understanding, the terrain between ignorance and knowledge where all human progress occurs. Outside, the world continues in its ancient patterns. Rivers flow, mountains stand. People walk paths worn smooth by countless feet before them. And somewhere, always, someone is trying to capture this in symbol and mark, creating maps that future archaeologists will someday puzzle over, that future cultures will misunderstand and partly understand, and eventually value not for what they got wrong, but for what they got profoundly right about the eternal human project of trying to know and show the world. The oldest map on Earth is trying to tell you that you are part of this lineage, this continuous chain of observers and markers and preservers. Your mind contains maps of your own world, internal cartographies of space and relationship and meaning. You are, in your own way, a map maker too, pressing marks into the clay of consciousness, trying to capture and preserve and transmit what you've learned, knowing it will be imperfect, knowing it will be misunderstood, knowing it will endure because the human need to map is as fundamental as the need to breathe, as ancient as awareness itself, and as persistent as the rivers that carved valleys in landscapes that existed long before anyone thought to mark them in clay, and long after all our careful cartographies have crumbled back to earth.